Okay, good afternoon, one and all.
האמת היא שאנחנו למושב
שכותרתו
עשויה לספק לאנשים כמוני לא מעט כותרות או לפחות תובנות, האם ישראל תנצח במלחמה הבאה, ובכמה דקות שבהן נדבר על העניין הזה עם חבורה די נכבדה, ננסה לברר גם מהו ניצחון וניצחון צבאי או גם מדיני, במדינה שלא ממש מוכנה לשלם כבר הרבה שנים את המחיר ורוצה ששת הימים, רק בלי המחיר של כמעט 900 הרוגים, כלומר הישג מקסימלי במחיר מינימלי ורוצה
another war. They've wanted it from the air and they don't want to do it remotely. They don't want boots on the ground. And let us not talking about all sorts of other words that have come into our language. But who wants this kind of war? I think they've been trying to get away from it since the Six-Day War. So we have the former Deputy Chief of IDF General Staff. He's now a politician, Major General Golan. And Major General in Reserves Amir, Eshel, former commander of the Israeli Air Force, and Major General Giora, Eiland, head of Israel National Security Council, and Mr. Amos, Harel, the military correspondent and defense analyst. I'm going to give each of them 4 minutes to talk, but I'm really going to rigidly keep to that timetable. That will perhaps help you in the future in politics. At any rate, the first person, please. I just got 20 more seconds. Okay. I'm Mr. Amos Harel. I'm going to be in the darkest shirt. All the rest are sort of the good people from the military. I'm the baddie. I think to my chagrin, the answer to will Israel win the next war, I don't think that they'll lose if it's in Lebanon or Gaza Strip or in Syria, but unfortunately it will be similar to all the other campaigns of the previous decades. Unfortunately, it's going to be some kind of ambiguous equal time. Israel will actually cause tremendous detrimental effect and collateral damage, not deliberately to the other side, but that's what's going to happen, because there's going to be tremendous fire against actual civilians, and we're also going to absorb it, perhaps not to the same scope that the other side will, but it'll be the worst damage that we've ever suffered. And you can see the precedent, there's no precedent to it, but it's really, we're going to see horrific condominiums toppling, etc., etc. And we've discussed this many a time, and I think that people were surprised by the narrative of the victory that higher echelons are going to try to market to us. So believe me, we will see these losses and this kind of damage, and it will happen if the Hezbollah does manage to have an upper hand in anything as time goes by. So these are the main scenarios, the main issues. Vis-a-vis what our Chief of General Staff, Aviv Kochavi, has been talking when he talks about the terror war. Now, what we have to the Hamas wants to continue launching those rockets, while the IDF wants, of course, to curb that. But unfortunately, this is going to be totally dissimilar to anything that we've ever experienced in the past. The question is, how much time will IDF have in order to reach a result that we will consider to be a victory until the international arena joins in, and where will Russia be and all that, what's going to happen with the Hezbollah. And the second question is about the quality of our ground forces, and I'd like to just say in brief, the reports of the Major General Brick said that he was people really attacked him because of what he said. I think that the IDF has undergone a very positive change during the Chief of Staff Eisengott's change, but unfortunately the gaps that have been created are enormous. And I think that when the reserve units are only training 5 days a year, if they suddenly go into a deep maneuver in Lebanon, unfortunately I think it's unrealistic. And the last point is that the echelons and the civilians, how they relate to all the fatalities and all the casualties. People find it very difficult to cope and grapple with that kind of situation. So do they want to take a risk and actually launch some kind of military campaign and to go out on a very expensive, long-winded war, especially if there are going to be barrages against the civilian population, that it's not something people will want to do. But I think that if you are looking for testimony to various things that have happened, the vision of 2030 of Prime Minister and the IDF, there are presented 5 really important things. What word does not appear there? Ground forces. In other words, they do not intend to actually invest in the ground forces. So well done that you managed to do it so quickly, but I think that the state of Israel, first of all, needs a strategy, and I don't think they have anything of that in the north or even in the Gaza Strip. So I think that that will tie into the various major generals that are going to talk now. Let us hear the first Major General Yair Golan. I think that Einstein once said that the stupidity of humankind is to do the same thing time and time again, hoping that something different will happen a second time. I'm sorry if I distorted things slightly, but unfortunately we have to recognize the fact that the question is not whether the IDF will win or not, but what does IDF need to do in order to win? In order to do that, they need to maneuver with the ground forces. They need to remove the threat against the home front as quickly as possible. But you cannot stop the missiles. You've got to simply lower that level of threat so that the home forces will be able to continue functioning, and that you can't do without boots on the ground, very deeply high-intensity conflict in urban terrain in the Gaza Strip. That's the only way. It's very frustrating, unexpected things that might pop up, but the only way to do that is to have a maneuver. But a maneuver has prices. But there are prices that have to be paid. There's a risk. But the military echelon understand that, so therefore they're not willing to take a risk unless the situation is one of emergency. So the next actually war, there will be such a threat against the home front that we will have to maneuver and go in with boots on the ground, because we maneuvered because there was no alternative. For example, in the Yom Kippur, it wasn't because we wanted to do it. We need to adapt to the idea that after 30 years of experience with campaigns and wars and minimal maneuver, we need to change the paradigmatic political paradigm and the military one, but we need a deep-set maneuver in order to really give a decisive victory and decisive defeat of the enemy and actually maximum destroy their artillery and their operational infrastructure. If we don't do that, the home front will continue suffering and be under threat, and we will be frustrated as a people. Well, you did it in half the time, I thought. So really, Giora, Eiland, if you wouldn't mind. The question is whether we will win or not is always connected to against who. Maccabi Tel Aviv, will they win the next? If it's against a very sort of low league play, but against Manchester City, no, they won't win. So it depends who they are facing in that war. And it's not only what we can expect it, because they're pretty surreal, these kind of people we're fighting against. And how do we define what is our enemy? If in Lebanon we decide what we decided in 2006, that the enemy is only the Hezbollah, when the Lebanon actually army, infrastructure, people and government are outside the game, then it's very difficult to win, even if we do maneuver. And I don't agree with Yair. The price that we will pay will be very difficult to actually say to ourselves how wonderful this achievement is, because when the dust is no longer there, we'll see how much distraction there is on the home front. So if No one in the world, Syria or Iran or Saudi Arabia or France or Lebanese or anyone or Hezbollah does not want to destroy Lebanon. So Israel then can create a reality in Lebanon that they will be calling upon for a ceasefire not after 33 days, but after a quarter of the time. So the question is whether they are winning or not depends on will I be able to create a situation where I am fighting against a state and not only a guerrilla organization or a terror organization. In Lebanon, it's very similar in the Gaza Strip as well. And again, the question is, do we define that our enemy is the Hamas terror organization? If so, it's very difficult to achieve what we want to achieve, and that is what we've seen for the last 12 years. But if we define the Gaza Strip as a state, as a country, and we find ourselves in a state of war against a country, and on the other hand, we will be able to manufacture between two countries some kind of condition wherein we'll have some kind of arrangement, not like it's happened up to now, but de facto recognizing their government in Gaza, but to create a situation like when they're shooting against us, that they're attacking a country. Then we'll be able perhaps to have the upper hand. But when we actually start working on how we should fight, this is all connected to the narrative of the definition of who this foe is. Israel will always have an advantage because they'll be able to situation against a country. Then they'll have the upper hand. Again, I've done it in half the time.
I won't get into what the definition of victory is, but if I imagine what would happen, and somebody here mentioned a very severe blow to Hezbollah, to Lebanon itself, and Syria too. I don't see Syria sitting on the sidelines after Hezbollah helped it get up off the floor. It will be involved to some sense or another. So it'll also be part of that story. We cannot ignore the Russian context. As long as they are here, I think we are held captive by certain paradigms. I don't think the Russian bear will allow a war of this kind to carry on for very long. It endangers its interest, and it has a way to get the message across when it wants it to be short, and it'll be shorter than we think. Two things that I'm sure won't happen at the end of this war, whether there's one type of victory or another. Hezbollah will not raise a white flag. There will be no surrender. Everyone will tell their own story. I don't want to change places with it. It will be struck to an extent that it cannot imagine. But another thing is that the home front will not remain as it was. We saw it in the past. It will be hit. It won't be destroyed, of course, but it will be hit much harder than people imagine. And that brings us back to the narrative. I think that the scope of the blows that the IDF is and will be able to deliver can create quiet for many years to come. I don't think I'm going out on a limb by saying that. If we think about the less successful war we had in 2006 and where we are today and the capabilities that have been accumulated by the IDF on land, in the air, and at sea, and in intelligence. And don't worry, Hezbollah won't disappear and terror won't disappear, but we can make a significant change. I believe that is one possible outcome. When can we say that we have won? I think that there will be a feeling like as what Amos described from the past. But in terms of time and over time, we will understand it as we understood in previous campaigns and wars, what we have achieved. Nothing is total, nothing is absolute or 100%. There's no knockout like in a boxing ring where you count to 10 and the other side doesn't get up. That doesn't happen. here, and also the format here to maneuver very deep in enemy territory. I think we will maneuver. I think this approach, if you'll forgive me, Yair, is overly romantic. It's suitable to Al Alamein. It's not suitable to today's wars. Once you have entered into a campaign of that kind, it can go on for months. You can't just shoot at southern Lebanon. Hezbollah has rockets that can cover the entire state of Israel. It's not a maneuver for 10 kilometers. It's 100 kilometers and not. And you can't go into every village either. We know this from the past. We've reached villages and in Gaza too. And it could be that 100 meters from the soldiers are still shooting at you from behind houses. And that is a recipe for something that's very long-term, and the costs, both strategically and in terms of human life, are unclear. Just to make that clear. Yair Golan, would you like to respond? I have two questions. We'll make it brief. First of all, I'd like you to relate to what Amos Harel said, because you were the deputy chief of staff of the IDF. Is General Brik correct that the IDF is not ready for war? Is the IDF that you suggest sending on a ground maneuver ready for that? Briefly, I would say yes. Yes, the price would be very high. Higher than we would have with a more ready ground force. There's been neglect for many years, decades perhaps, which is the result of the big wars, the Yom Kippur War and the First Lebanon War. And since then, the investment in the ground forces has been lower relative to the other branches of the army. So if, to sum that up, Brik is correct, but not for the reasons that he mentions. Could you relate to what Amir Eshel said, that your idea is romantic and more suitable to El Alamein than to today? First of all, we have to bear in mind what the national security doctrine of the State of Israel is. We want to cause our enemy to despair of the very idea of war, and you can't do them if you don't strike a strong enough blow. The question of what a strong enough blow is, I gave my interpretation earlier. We can talk about it. It doesn't have to be a single correct answer. Secondly, does the war necessarily have to develop into a regional war? The answer is it can, but it doesn't have to. If, for example, we're able to restrict it, it's not dependent only on us, to a large probability. If there is external involvement, for example, Russian involvement, that doesn't necessarily lead to their active involvement or dramatic influence. It, of course, depends how things develop. And the third thing is that I don't think that if we declare war on the state of Lebanon now, that will change anything. The moment you do a broad-based ground campaign, and also when you have bombing on that scale, the extent of destruction is so great, and the ability to distinguish between a strike on Hezbollah and a strike on Lebanon is impossible. So I suggest to remove that from the decision. Diplomatic pressure to end the war, I don't think that will happen. All those all around us will be happy with a relatively restricted war. If Israel fights Hezbollah and Hezbollah fights Israel, perhaps the only ones that will cry out are the Iranians, who are afraid that they will lose their project, but I don't think their voice will be a very influential one. And the last thing is the matter of a decision, a decisive war, and how to reach a decisive outcome. I'd like to say to this distinguished audience, after all the total concepts of a la Second World War, there are three concepts: complete destruction, forcing a diplomatic settlement, or annexation. And none of these options are relevant to the Israeli case. Israel never intended to completely defeat an enemy. In the context of Israel, we're only talking about a decisive military outcome. But when we are talking about a decentralized enemy that is over a large area, we have to bring them to the inability to use their military force. And for for that, you don't have to reach the last launcher, and you don't have to maneuver towards every single launcher in northern Lebanon. That's not necessary. I think that something good will happen on the way, but that requires a significant investment, and I'm aware of the risk involved both to the political level and to the IDF, and in general, you're filibustering, I think, for your friends, and that's part of the matter. I say that to everyone who is in this distinguished audience. What is the scope of damage we're willing to absorb on our home front, and what is the relationship that should develop between an army and its nation? Okay, Giora Eiland. The heading of this panel, I'm thinking about this when I discussed it with Amos, is that Israel triumphs in this war. We have three generals here, and you're in the question of whether Israel will win is actually a diplomatic subject, and there are no politicians on the stage. It's not only a military question. Does Israel have a policy? Does it know what it wants in the north and in the south? I said, earlier that we don't have a real strategy in either arena. I will relate. I'll be brief. I want to mention four things. Not only does Israel not have a strategy, it's a whole issue how decisions are made in Israel. Let's take Lebanon for an example. What Yair and I spoke about here are two very different positions. One strategy says, in general terms, let's do what we did strategically in 2006. The enemy was Hezbollah. Well, we'll do it much better this time and much more daringly this time. And the second strategy, which I think is the right one, says no. The enemy should be the state of Lebanon, and there's a big difference. The question is not who is correct. The question is, before the war starts, will the state of Israel, will the government of Israel think about these things and come up with the right strategy if there is a third Lebanon war? And the answer is no. And when the fire starts from Lebanon, they'll be discussing at the same time the reports of the incident this morning, and all kinds of intelligence reports, and try to come up with a strategy at the same time. That's a deep-set weakness that we have, but that's not the subject of this panel, so I won't go on with that. There are three important points. One is the time factor. We often say we have to try to do things as quickly as possible and hope that the politicians will get us enough time because the diplomatic clock is ticking, and now it's almost the opposite. What happened in the second Lebanon war is, what did the world say to us? The world said, who are you fighting against? Hezbollah? Okay, they're bad guys, kill them. What did the world say to Hezbollah? Who are you fighting? The Jews? They're bad guys, you kill them. And it lasted 33 days and nobody cared. Israel has clear advantages. It's hard to discuss it here in detail in a war that carries on a short time. The operative advantages that we have in the early days are great, and the advantage of the other side is every day that the war carries on, and so the time factor reverses. And the second issue is the matter of the preparedness of the ground force. There's a confusion here between them here. Is the ground war technically prepared in terms of equipment and so on? I think yes, on a good level, differently from what Brick tried to describe. It's never 100% because you don't want it to have 100%, because it's a very high price to 100%. To have 100% preparedness of all the tanks and everything at the same time will mean something's missing somewhere else. On the other hand, there's an erosion of the ground force's ability in certain areas. One, in the ability and independence of the ground units. I was amazed when a colonel came to me from the ground forces and showed me some things, and I can tell you what an infantry brigade was 10 years ago. They were better equipped than they are today. So there's an erosion there. And a further erosion that exists is in the in-depth understanding of what it means to be a professional army. So if in the past the professional army, certainly infantry, was based on the ability of commanders to understand the field and the enemy, what we're talking today about when we say professional is the ability to operate gadgets. And this could be very problematic in real real time. And the final point, perhaps the most important one, is the gap between expectations and capabilities in the types of war today, not only here of the Americans and the British and everyone else too. All those who are fighting against guerrilla and terror organizations that are very well integrated into the civilian population. There is an inherent gap between expectations and ability. There are 4 expectations that are hard to achieve. 1 is complete victory over the enemy. 2, to do it in a short time. 3, to do it without too many casualties to our forces. And 4, to do it when we're only hitting the bad guys and not the civilians. And all of these are 4 expectations that we try to guarantee, and the reality is much more difficult, and this creates what Amos called a sense of a missed opportunity, that we were unable to achieve what we expected to.
Without ground forces going into brick, without going into all that danger, do you believe that we're talking, you remember used to talk about actually turning this into an entire plant? Is this something that can now actually win wars if we only do it from above like that? Look, there's no war. You can't have actually sort of a recipe that will work. It's more from the world of art. I don't specifically like that, but now the question is whether there should be a maneuver or not a maneuver. This emanated from the actual ground challenge. That's where it all came from. It's not in the open spaces. And a lone wolf terrorist knows what today to do just as much as a tank once knew how to do. If you send, for example, an entire division, it's fantastic, but actually at the friction points, when suddenly someone jumps out of a tunnel behind them, then it's 3 against 3. It's very complex. It's very different. Things have changed immensely. You're not going to hear me say that there's no need for a maneuver. The question is, what kind of maneuver? What will it achieve? And what price will be paid? And how do we extricate ourselves from it? And how will we leave it afterwards? How does it end the bottom line? Like the army, the third Amir in the Yom Kippur War? No, lots of questions. So there is still of tremendous importance to the maneuver vis-a-vis changing the way the enemy's perception is. In other words, they think that if they could invade, Israel didn't exist a few years ago. But now they're thinking about it in a different way. You don't actually do your defense at the goalie in football. You do it before that. So if you think that you can actually negate their capabilities all the way down to the last missile and last rocket in their arsenal, no, it won't happen. It'll take hundreds of thousands. That's what they've got. So if we've managed to destroy 80% of their arsenal, while on the offensive and the defensive, they've still got tens of thousands. So you can only, if you do it only with boots on the ground, with a ground forces maneuver, no, the price will be too heavy. There's a dramatic change in our intel and in the air. And I'm not just talking about numbers of how many campaigns and how many bodies, but our capability of really surprising them with a tremendous across the board. I don't think that the actual audience can even understand what we're really talking about when we're talking about the size. Quantitatively, over the last few years, the Air Force, what it has done in 33 days in the Second Lebanon War, they can now do over 60 hours. If you double that with the intel capabilities, there will be something in a totally different order of magnitude. Will that be the decisive blow in the war? No. Will the politicians know how to take these short-term achievements that have been done and translate them into something that will bring us a real political victory, then I believe yes. So Amos, I'd like to sort of tie all the edges and again come in from the sort of political echelons how we saw in the past how suddenly they went into a state of war or things that have happened before that. Don't you think that's some way of bringing better solutions? Or maybe isn't there something that we can hold on so that at the end of the day we'll be able to hold up a sort of a flag and say, ooh, we won? It sounds a bit childish. I think the question, I mean, these things are really lacking, and there was an attempt of Chief of Staff Eisenkopf when he spoke about the IDF strategy. They were really trying to rape the political echelons into have some kind of open dialogue. We saw various things and we documented the way they keep looking for some kind of victory picture, really down to the details of literally counting the casualty. And they speak about lethality and things like that, which I really think that people shouldn't talk about. But I think that when we were talking about all this in a kind of closed-off room while ignoring the political and the economic side, it's wonderful that there are grandiose plans that the army has and the chief of staff, but the political situation is totally different, and its significance is we're going to actually have another round of elections which will postpone everything for about a year and a half. And if we're thinking about the economy, hey, they need a year and a half to really plan that budget. Only in a year and a half will we have a stable government that will enable us to talk about all these things. It'll only happen to the elections, and then it'll take time. So all these wonderful big programs that everyone is talking about, this Herculean effort that they're talking about, then you've got to think about that at the same time talking about the people lying in the corridors in the hospitals and the education of our children, etc., etc. And the IDF won't have the money that they think they're going to have, the money that they're hoping for. We've only got 7.5 minutes now left, but I'm going to be very cruel if I steal half a minute from you and apologize for having an ugly cut on my... He's saying it in English. So,
young gentleman, instead of thinking of your speech and cutting your face, you should have thought of your face and cut your speech.
That's exactly it. What he's saying, I'm going to be cruel and you've got to cut your speech after that joke. So Amos mentioned it. Israeli society has become, and it's good that we really fear the fatalities, but maybe we're mollycoddling people too much and we're become like cotton wool. It's as if we're willing for the home front to be detrimentally affected and harmed as long as our soldiers won't be hit. But in the world of army, this is something that doesn't exist. What kind of war can we expect in those kind of circumstances? And what will we say to the public at the end of the day? The Israeli public is very strong and steadfast. It has stood the challenge and the winds of time over these the lone wolf terror, and it stood it steadfastly, the resilience, that ongoing threat, even in the Gaza Strip and in the localities around it. We can actually really salute them because they're people with deep Zionist feelings and they want the benefit of the state of Israel, and that's not surprising. So let us rely and trust the Israeli public. They're not alienated. They are our parents and our spouses and our children, and we honor them and feel tremendous respect for them, and that's justified. And so, yes, we have to prepare the public and talk to them as adults, as responsible adults, and they will pay the price, and they will be respectful towards us as we show them respect. Another question is the issue of leadership. That is a different question. Would you like to relate to that? and talk about everything that you wrote down. I think that we ought to be cautious about determinist statements. I don't know what. Oh, if we go in, we'll be stuck inside because we have that model of the First Lebanon War. And if we go into the Gaza Strip, boots on the ground, and we'll be stuck there. It doesn't have to be like that. We talk about, military people. They sort of, it's as if they tend to plan for the war that's already been. It's not because of stupidity. It's because we sort of are stuck in paradigmatic ways of thinking that are very difficult to extricate ourselves from. So let us really make an enormous effort to try and extricate ourselves from that, because the next war is going to be very different, and we have to do something differently. For the last 55 years, we've been doing things pretty similar, and then the enemy doesn't seem to be excited by it. I think that's vis-a-vis when you quoted Einstein, when he said, basically, you're continuing that thought and saying, what should we do that will be different? Oh, I don't know what we could do different so that we won't be doomed. We've got the instruments, we've got the artillery, and we've got the arms. Let us just use them with power. Are you talking about political determination and perseverance? Well, all kinds of perseverance and determination, military, political, but even just on sort of the touch of the iceberg. Look about the last, sort of the end of Protective Edge. We started using aggressive force and aggressive fire. I would have been happy had we used that from the very beginning. It wasn't sort of, it was definitely discriminatory. We didn't do it against those we didn't want to. But we do have advantages that are absolute. And I am the last person to say swap with the enemy because their circumstances are much worse. And we might end up with a feeling that we've missed out on something. But if we can buy some peace for a number of years, I'm willing to settle for that. Do you think that we should do something that will last, that kind of, sort of that round will last a number of years? What worries me is not the civilian home front, but that connects to the Hezbollah and Iran trying to actually manufacture weapons of precision and heavier warheads. But actually, they're actually trying to get these precision weapons, which is very different from statistic weapons. It's not, they're sort of aiming at one neighborhood in Tel Aviv, and by chance they'll hit out at something else. We're a very small state with very few national infrastructure, and unfortunately amateur construction without a big national overview, and that is our sensitivity and vulnerability. For example, the power plants in Israel. 90% of our generation of electricity is within 11% of a location in Israel, instead of having it deployed and dispersed all over the country. So therefore, if you ask me about what is missing in our future look ahead, is that we should have some kind of better protection of our national infrastructures, because that is our Achilles heel. So I'd like to look at our civilians now a little bit, because we really live within that civilian population. What does the public in Israel not know? And what is the gap between that lack of knowledge and reality? I've got a problem with this kind of panels, because it's as if we're sort of trying to frighten everyone and threatening and saying oi 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 and theory and frightening and what's going to happen. I don't think we ought to do that. One of the people just said, yes, but we need headlines. But I think that we ought to tell people the truth, not in order to frighten them, but as a complex situation. And that is exactly the gap between the expectations. People, for example, the civilians are really impressed by the precise attacks in Syria and the Iron Dome achievements. But more than that, they need to add that many people who actually are busy with public spins and frightening them and I think it is our role from time to time to sit, and that is your role as well, and our role as well, to sit down and say, hey, are we doing this well enough? Are we doing this well enough? And we shouldn't actually be listening to all these funny sort of statements that are coming out and that are just frightening everyone. Okay, it's my privilege as a moderator. Yair Golan, now as a fresh politician, just out of the oven. And for someone who came from the outside and spoke more than anything about leadership, how much leadership is lacking when we fear the next war? How much leadership is missing, is lacking on a political and military level? Well, that's a very tough question. You've actually joined Ehud Barak now, because he's first class at dismantling difficult questions and trying to find solutions for each of the little parts of them. I think that what Amos said, boy, that is the real crux of the issue. And to take these topics, and they're not just around the corner, but they definitely are there on the agenda, and they ought to be brought to the center of the public agenda and say, this is the situation, this is what we're facing, this is what we're to do. Amos and you are talking about a leadership in potential. It does exist, that kind of leadership, but unfortunately at the moment, no, not sufficient. So thank you very much.